There's a particular kind of genius in knowing how to disappear in plain sight. For Dean Martin, it wasn't about vanishing from rooms. It was about vanishing into a character so convincing that the man underneath became almost mythical. Everyone knew Dean Martin, the performer, the sleepy eyes, the casual sophistication, the way he'd croon a song while cradling a glass of what the audience assumed was scotch. What they didn't know, what most of Las Vegas didn't know, was that the drunk act was just that, an act. The apple juice in that crystal tumbler was the most expensive costume piece in his entire wardrobe. It gave him permission, it gave him cover. It allowed him to be unpredictable, to interrupt songs, to charm his way out of social conventions that bound other performers. But more than that, it gave him something precious, the ability to observe without judgment being passed back on him. Who pays attention to a drunk man wandering through a room? Nobody, which meant Dean Martin could see everything. The year was 1964, and Las Vegas was still writing its own mythology. The city hadn't yet calcified into the machine it would become. It was still hungry, still violent in the way beautiful things sometimes are. The Sands Hotel and Casino stood at the epicenter of this universe like a glittering sun, and if you weren't orbiting it, you simply didn't matter. The Copa Room was the Sands' beating heart, the venue where legends were made and fortunes changed hands across felt-covered tables in darkened corners. On this particular Tuesday night in the deep part of winter, the air carried that specific Vegas weight cigarette smoke so thick it had texture, the competing fragrances of expensive perfumes and the metallic scent of casino air conditioning fighting for dominance. The room was full of the kinds of people who made empires, oil barons, real estate moguls, a few carefully selected organized crime figures with enough discretion to know when to smile and when to disappear, politicians whose names wouldn't appear in newspapers, and tourists who'd spent months saving to afford this one night in paradise. They sat at tables arranged in a careful hierarchy, with the whale tables, the high rollers who regularly dropped $50,000 to $100,000 in a weekend positioned closest to the stage. These were the people who mattered. Everyone else was scenery. Dean Martin commanded the stage with the kind of ease that only comes from someone who's been performing since he was young enough to believe in magic. He was moving through a standard, one of those golden age standards that had the power to make middle-aged men remember they were once capable of romance. He toyed with the lyrics, pretending to forget lines, letting the orchestra carry him while he focused on the audience, reading their faces like a card counter reads a deck. The women in the audience were melting. The men were relaxing into that particular male contentment that comes from watching a masterwork. Dean was barely exerting any effort. He didn't need to. He was Dean Martin. But underneath the performance, behind those heavy-lidded eyes that seemed barely awake, his mind was working differently than people realized. Dean Martin had a gift that would only be fully understood after his death. The gift of attention. Not the kind of attention that required focus or effort, but the natural, almost supernatural awareness of a man who'd grown up having very little and had learned early that survival sometimes depends on reading a room. He noticed things. He noticed micro-expressions. He noticed the way conversations shifted. He noticed vulnerability. So, when the energy in the room changed just barely, just enough that most people wouldn't consciously register, Dean noticed immediately. It was happening at one of the whale tables, table 4. He kept singing, but his eyes found the source. A young woman, maybe 23, was moving between the tables with the particular exhaustion of someone working for survival. Her shoes were cheap, the kind that don't breathe properly, and you could see her shifting her weight from one foot to the other as she stood at the table, a practiced movement designed to minimize pain. Her name was Alina, though Dean didn't know that yet. What he could see was the calculation in her eyes. She was doing the math. Tips, minus childcare costs, minus rent, minus the bus fare to get to the wrong side of Vegas where she lived in an apartment that probably had a view of an alley. She was surviving. At table 4 sat a man who would later be referred to only as Sterling, and Sterling represented a particular type of wealth that had recently emerged in America. Oil money from Texas, the kind of money that was loud and aggressive and convinced of its own righteousness. Sterling had started drinking at noon before he'd even checked into his suite. By 6 in the evening, when the show started, he was already working on his third bourbon of the night. Money had made him careless. It had made him think that volume was the same as power, that rudeness was the same as confidence. Sterling was also the kind of man who tested boundaries. Throughout the evening, he'd done the small cruelties that wealth sometimes permits. He'd sent back dishes not because they were actually wrong, but because he wanted to assert dominance over the kitchen, over the servers, over anyone within the sphere of his influence. He'd snapped his fingers at busboys with the same tone he might use with a dog. He surrounded himself with smaller men who laughed at his jokes with the intensity of hyenas, rewarding his worst instincts. And as the evening wore on and his inhibitions wore down, he'd begun looking at Alina with a particular kind of attention. Not the attention of desire, but the attention of a predator identifying weakness. Alina was assigned to table for the whale table, the table where tips could be exceptional, but the emotional labor required was immeasurable. She approached Sterling's section knowing she needed tonight. She always needed tonight. Her son, 2 years old, still in that age where he believed his mother was the center of the universe, was with a neighbor, a kind woman who couldn't afford to watch him for free much longer. The math wasn't working. It was never working. When Sterling's glass ran empty, it wasn't an accident that his reaction was sharp. It was calculated. He was testing what he could get away with. His voice cut across the ambient noise of the room, engineered to be loud enough that nearby tables could hear. "Hey, sweetheart, my glass is empty. You blind or just stupid?" It was the kind of verbal slap that might seem minor to an observer, but registered like a physical blow to Alina. Her face flushed. She moved toward his glass with the ingrained response of service industry workers everywhere. The apology that wasn't her fault, the self-blame that shouldn't belong to her. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'll get you another right away." "Don't tell me you're sorry," Sterling sneered, and his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, not gently, the wrist of a working person doing a job. His eyes held something like amusement at her statement. "Tell me why I shouldn't have you fired right now." Alina pulled back, gentle but firm, trying not to create a scene because scenes at table 4 were remembered, retold, and usually resulted in consequences for staff, not for customers. Her heart was racing in that particular way. It races when adrenaline meets powerlessness. On stage, the music kept playing. The band was swinging. Dean Martin was trading subtle jokes with Ken Lane at the piano about some song neither of them remembered anymore. But Dean's eyes had found Alina. He'd seen the grab. He'd seen the way her face changed. And he'd made a decision, one that would cost him in complicated ways later, but it was made. Something shifted in him. Alina returned with Sterling's Drinka double scotch neat, exactly how he liked it. Her hands were shaking enough that she could feel it, and she moved with the careful precision of someone trying to stay invisible. She leaned in to place the glass on the white tablecloth, her movements controlled, her breathing shallow, and Sterling moved. It was subtle enough that you could almost convince yourself it was an accident. His elbow jerked. The heavy crystal glass clipped the edge of her tray. The physics of the moment were violent. The glass toppled. Amber liquid splashed across Sterling's soutane, expensive, Italian silk thing that probably cost more than Alina made in 2 weeks. The ice cubes scattered across the floor like small diamonds, skittering into corners under other tables. The music kept playing, but the room's energy fractured. The audience's heads turned. You could see it happen. This moment where everyone present suddenly became aware that something other than entertainment was occurring. This was real. This was actual human drama, and the stakes felt significant in a way that even the best performance couldn't manufacture. Sterling stood up, and his face underwent a transformation. The color rose in his neck first, then spread to his cheeks, then deepened to a shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure was doing something concerning. When he yelled, it wasn't a loud voice, it was an explosion. It was the sound of someone accustomed to immediate obedience encountering its absence. "You clumsy little idiot. Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" Alina was already on her knees, her body moving into the posture of apology that women in service sometimes adopt without conscious thought. She was trying to clean the mess with a napkin, her movements frantic, her eyes beginning to blur with tears. Not tears of sadness exactly, but tears of fear and shame and the recognition that her carefully maintained balance was about to tip. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'm so very sorry. It just slipped. I didn't mean to." It slipped. Sterling's voice had moved past anger into something else, something uglier. It slipped. This suit costs more than you'll make in a lifetime. You know that? This single suit. And then he did something that would echo through the rest of the evening. He kicked the napkin from her hand. It wasn't a violent kick, not designed to cause physical harm, but it was designed to cause something else: humiliation. It was violence dressed up as accident. It was the assertion of dominance through the only means available to him. "Manager?" Sterling bellowed, his voice carrying across the room. "Where's the manager? I want this incompetent trash out of here. Right now. Now." The floor manager, nervous man in an immaculately pressed tuxedo, who'd probably been dealing with difficult customers all evening, came rushing over like a man running toward a car accident. He began apologizing to Sterling with the particular servility of someone whose job depended on keeping whales happy. And then he looked at Alina, and Alina saw the moment her employment became a liability. He looked at her with pity, which was almost worse than anger, because pity meant the decision had already been made. Alina was sobbing now, not hysterically, but with the kind of silent, shaking cry of someone watching their world contract in real time. She could see it happen, the rent money evaporating, the conversation with the neighbor about whether she could watch her son for another month, the further downward spiral. She could see the end because she'd seen this ending before. That was the moment when the music died. It wasn't a gradual fade-out. It wasn't a musical phrase coming to a natural conclusion. Dean Martin turned to the band and made a cutting motion across his throat, sharp and decisive. The music stopped like it had been physically severed. The sudden silence in a room that had been filled with orchestral sound was almost shocking. 800 people held their breath. Dean Martin stood at center stage, the cigarette in his hand still burning, still producing its long trail of smoke. The character you'd been watching for the last hour, the swaying, slurring, barely awake drunk, that character simply ceased to exist. In his place stood something different. You could see the difference in his posture, the straightening of his spine, the sharpening of his eyes. This was Dean Martin of Steubenville, Ohio. This was the kid who'd worked in steel mills and understood what it meant to have nothing. This was the man who dealt blackjack in illegal back rooms and knew what predatory behavior looked like because he'd seen it up close his entire life. He placed his microphone down on the piano with a soft thump that carried through the silence. He walked to the edge of the stage, and instead of using the stairs like a normal person would, he hopped down, landing softly on the carpeted floor. He was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and in that moment, something about his physicality seemed to expand. He looked 10 feet tall. He looked like someone you didn't want to disappoint. He walked through the tables. The crowd, almost involuntarily, parted for him. Not because he was pushing through, but because people sensed something in his movement that suggested it would be best not to be in his way. He didn't look at the fans reaching out to touch him. He didn't acknowledge the mob bosses in the front row who suddenly looked uncomfortable. He walked straight to table 4, where Sterling was still wiping his jacket with a napkin, still fuming. But when Sterling looked up and saw Dean approaching, something shifted in his face. There was a moment where he expected the standard response, a joke from the king of cool, something to diffuse the situation with laughter and charm. Maybe Dean would buy him a drink. Maybe he'd make a quip at Elena's expense, a way to smooth things over, a way to let the whale win without appearing to care. That's what entertainers did. That's what the game required. Sterling forced a grin. "Dino," he called out, his voice trying for casual. "Look at this mess, huh? Can you believe the help these days? Good thing you're here to save the night." Dean didn't smile. He didn't slow his approach until he was inches from Sterling's face. Close enough that Sterling could smell his concision something European and expensive and the peppermint gum he was chewing. Close enough that the physical dominance was undeniable. Dean looked down at Alina, still on her knees, still trying to pick up ice cubes with trembling hands. Without breaking eye contact with Sterling, Dean reached down. His hand, manicured and adorned with a pinky ring, was gentle. He took Elena's arm and helped her to her feet, his movements careful and deliberate. "Stand up, sweetheart," Dean said, and his voice wasn't the booming baritone from the stage, it was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that commands attention. You don't bow to him. You don't bow to anybody. Alina looked up at him, her mascara running, her eyes full of terror and confusion, and something else, the beginning of understanding. that something was shifting in her favor. Dean turned to Sterling. "She ruined my suit," Sterling protested, but the confidence was already draining from his voice. "I'm a paying customer. I spend $50,000 a weekend in this joint." Dean looked at the suit. Then he looked Sterling in the eye, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly to the nearby tables, calm and measured. "You know, I've spilled more booze on my tuxedos than you've ever drank in your life. It dries, it cleans. But being a bully, that kind of stain doesn't come out." Sterling bristled. His ego was bruising visibly, and he wasn't accustomed to that sensation. "Do you know who I am? I could buy and sell this hotel." Dean took a step closer. "You can buy the hotel," he said, "but you can't buy class. And you certainly can't buy the right to treat a lady like dirt in my room, your room." Sterling laughed, but it was the laugh of a man who was beginning to understand he'd made a miscalculation. "I pay your salary, Singer." That was the moment. That was when something dangerous flickered across Dean's face. He didn't hit Sterling. He didn't need to. He leaned in close, closing the distance until their noses almost touched. The entire showroom leaned forward. Security guards tensed. Frank Sinatra, sitting in a booth in the back, stopped mid-conversation. This was the dangerous Dean, the one whose connections ran deep, the one who supposedly knew guys who solved problems in the Nevada desert. Dean whispered something. 5 seconds of whispering, just 5 seconds. But Sterling's face went pale, not a little pale. The kind of white that comes when blood drains from your face because your body is registering genuine fear. His eyes darted to the side, looking for exits. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. His hands, which had been aggressive moments before, suddenly looked fragile. Dean pulled back, straightened his tuxedo jacket, and winked at Ali. The action was so casual, so smooth, that it felt like the rest of the room didn't quite catch it. "Get your things," Dean said to Sterling, his voice returning to something approximating normal volume. "And get out." "You can't kick me out," Sterling stammered, but he was already backing away, already moving toward the exit, already looking for the security escorts who had appeared, as if summoned by the laws of physics, on either side of him. Dean looked at the floor manager, who was trembling visibly. "He's leaving," Dean said simply. "Check is on the house. But if he ever sets foot in the sands again, while I'm breathing, I walk. And Frank walks. And Sammy walks." That was the nuclear option. That was the statement that made the ownership pale because they understood immediately what it meant. The Sands without the Rat Pack was just a building in the desert. The Sands with the Rat Pack was the center of the universe. The ownership understood the hierarchy, and Dean had just made it clear. The manager found his courage somewhere. "Security," he called out. 2 large men appeared and escorted a stunned, silent Sterling out of the showroom. The room watched him go, watched his expensive suit disappear through the doors, watched the moment when power shifted back to where it belonged. For one more second, the room was silent. And then, it didn't just applaud, it erupted. It wasn't the polite applause that follows a well-sung song, it was something primal. It was the roar of a crowd that had just witnessed something they recognized as real. It was respect. It was gratitude. It was the sound of people recognizing that they'd just seen someone use power for something other than domination. But Dean wasn't done. He turned to Alina, who was still shaking, still clutching her tray against her chest like a shield. He approached her with the same gentleness he'd shown when helping her to her feet. "What's your name, honey?" he asked, and his voice carried the genuineness of someone who actually wanted to know. "Alina," she whispered. Dean reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a wallet. He pulled out a clip of cash, the kind of roll that only men who gambled regularly carried, thick, substantial. He didn't count it, he didn't look at it. He simply took the entire roll and pressed it into Elena's hand. "Buy a new dress," he said, "and something nice for your kid. I know you got one. You got that mama bear look in your eyes. I've seen it before." Alina looked at the money in her hand. There had to be thousands of dollars there, more than she made in a year, way more. Her hands started to shake again, but for a different reason this time. "Mr. Martin, I can't." "I can't possibly." "You can," Dean said. And he flashed that $1,000,000 smile, the one that made the world feel like it might be okay after all. "Consider it a tip for dealing with the garbage." Then he hopped back onto the stage with an ease that suggested the last few minutes hadn't depleted any of his energy. He picked up his drink, the apple juice, still there, still waiting, and raised it to the ceiling. "Now, where were we?" he said, and before anyone could answer, the band kicked in. The music returned, the spell resumed, and as far as the audience was concerned, the show went on. Alina was sent home early, not as punishment, but with a personal escort from hotel security to ensure she got home safely with the cash. She never waited tables again. With that money, she enrolled in nursing school. She built a life that wasn't built on survival calculations. She raised her son. She became someone in her own right. But for 5 decades, the mystery remained. What did Dean Martin whisper to Sterling? What could he possibly have said that transformed a raging tycoon, someone accustomed to winning through sheer force of personality, into a frightened man in the span of 5 seconds? The legend grew with every retelling. Some people said Dean had threatened to call his mob connections, that he'd suggested Sterling would wake up in the desert if he didn't leave immediately. Others claimed Dean had threatened to kill the man himself, that he'd made it clear that violence was a possibility. The story became more dramatic with each telling, more violent, more dangerous. It fit the Las Vegas mythology. It fit the era. It fit what people wanted to believe about Dean Martin and the power he wielded. Alina kept the secret. She never revealed what was whispered. She honored the man who had saved not just her job but her dignity. She raised her son in quiet gratitude, and she lived a life that was full and real and built on something other than fear. But in 2014, as her health was failing, as she lay in a hospital bed, understanding that this was the end of her story, she finally told her son the truth. She told him what the King of Cool whispered that night in the smoke-filled Copa room. Dean hadn't threatened violence. He hadn't mentioned the mob. He hadn't mentioned money or connections or anything that would fit the legend. Instead, he'd looked Sterling in the eye and said something that was, in its own way, far more devastating than any threat could have been. "I saw you looking at her before the spill. You bumped her arm on purpose. I watched you do it. If you don't walk out of here right now, I'm going to take this microphone and tell every single person in this room, including your wife back in Texas, exactly what you were trying to do." Because Dean hadn't just seen a clumsy waitress who had dropped a drink. That was the version everyone else in the room accepted, the easy explanation, the harmless accident. But Dean saw past that surface story almost instantly. What he saw was intent. He saw calculation. He saw a man carefully shaping a moment to his advantage. He saw a predator testing the edges of what he could get away with. First the spill, then the sharp look, the exaggerated sigh, the subtle shift in posture that turned an accident into an accusation. He saw the man gauging the room, gauging the power dynamic, gauging whether anyone would intervene. He saw the slow escalation beginning, not loud, not violent, but deliberate. The kind of escalation that relies on embarrassment and fear rather than force. Dean recognized it for what it was, one of the oldest and ugliest tricks there is. Public humiliation as a weapon. Make someone feel small. Make them doubt themselves. Make them apologize for something that doesn't truly deserve punishment. Once a person accepts that first layer of shame, it becomes easier to push further, to demand more, to cross lines that would otherwise never be crossed. Dean had seen it before, in different forms, carried out by men who understood that dominance doesn't always start with violence, it often starts with humiliation, and he shut it down immediately. That was the real power in what Dean did that night. Not the volume of his voice, not the authority of his presence, but the clarity of his perception. He didn't react to the surface problem, he addressed the real one. He didn't treat it as an accident gone wrong. He treated it as a situation that was about to turn dangerous in quieter, more insidious ways. Dean didn't save Alina because a drink had spilled. He saved her because he understood exactly what was unfolding beneath the surface. He saw someone being positioned as a target, and he refused to allow it to continue. He used his own status, his confidence, and his unspoken authority to interrupt the pattern before it could complete itself. That was the difference. Dean didn't just intervene, he recognized the truth of the moment and acted on it. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that real power isn't about exploiting vulnerability. It's about recognizing it, choosing to protect it. The world saw the tuxedo, the cigarette, the drink. They saw the king of cool who didn't seem to have a care in the world, who moved through rooms like nothing could touch him, who charmed his way through life with a smile and a song? But that night, in a dimly lit casino, Dean Martin showed the world who he really was underneath the performance. He was the man who noticed. He was the man who understood that cool isn't about how you wear your suit or how you hold your liquor. Cool isn't about the power you can display or the money you can spend. Cool is about how you treat the person who is cleaning up your mess. Cool is about stepping in when you see someone being hurt, even if it complicates your own life. Cool is about recognizing power and choosing to use it for protection instead of domination. Elena's son, who grew up to be a doctor thanks to that tip, thanks to a second chance his mother got because someone noticed her, still visits the spot where the sands used to stand. He makes the pilgrimage several times a year, usually in the middle of the week when tourists aren't flooding the strip, when he can find a moment of relative quiet. The building itself is long gone now, demolished in 1996, where the Copa Room once stood, where 800 people held their breath and watched a man stand up for someone he didn't know. There's now empty space and memory. The era that built Vegas, that raw, dangerous, glamorous era where mob money and entertainment collided in the desert, that era is gone too. The cities changed, the people changed, the rules changed, but the memory remains. It has to remain, because without it, the moment loses its meaning. He's told the story to his own children, and they've told their children. Each generation carries it forward. This small piece of testimony about what happened on a Tuesday night in 1964, but standing in the actual spot, looking at the modern Vegas rising around him with its corporate money and its engineered experiences, he understands something that maybe Elena understood too. The memory matters more than the building. The lesson matters more than the location. He says that sometimes, if you listen very closely to the noise of the modern Las Vegas Strip, you can somehow get past the cacophony of digital bells and synthesized music and all the manufactured excitement of the newer casinos with their algorithmic lighting and their carefully constructed experiences designed to keep you inside. You can still hear something else beneath it all. Not the orchestra, not the applause that erupted that night, not the voice of Dean Martin singing into a microphone, but something more subtle than all of that, something quieter but infinitely more powerful. The sound of someone standing up when it mattered. The sound of someone choosing integrity in a moment where compromise would have been easier, more profitable, more comfortable. The sound of a man choosing dignity over profit in a city literally built on the principle of extracting money from the vulnerable. And that sound, that subtle resonance of moral courage, it doesn't fade, it echoes, it persists. It outlasts the buildings and the careers and the eras. Because people carry it in their hearts. Elena carried it, her son carries it, and everyone who hears this story carries it forward. It becomes part of their understanding of what a human being is capable of when they choose to be more than their circumstances, more than their self-interest, more than the survival instinct that usually governs behavior in places like Las Vegas. Dean Martin played the drunk for thousands of nights. He played that character so convincingly, so consistently, that it became inseparable from who he was in the public imagination. But on this particular Tuesday night in 1964, he was the most sober man in that room. Not sober in the conventional sense. He was absolutely awake. He was absolutely present. He was clearly seeing Sterling's predatory behavior, seeing Elena's vulnerability, seeing the moment where he could step in and change something. In a city built entirely on illusions, on constructed fantasies, and carefully manufactured moments designed to separate people from their money and their dignity, his kindness was the only real thing that lasted. It was the only thing that actually meant something beyond itself. It created ripples. Because Elena became a nurse, she helped people, she brought her son into the world as a different kind of man than Sterling would have needed to be if his behavior had gone unchecked. That boy became a doctor. He's saved lives. He's probably delivered babies. He's probably sat with dying patients and held their hands when no one else would. And all of that, all of those lives he's touched, all of that emanates backward from the moment when Dean Martin decided to intervene. That's the multiplication of kindness. That's the way a single act of courage can reshape the trajectory of a life and then reshape countless other lives through that person. There's a moment in your life, probably more than one moment, if you're being honest, where you wish someone had stepped in for you. A moment where you were small and someone large was using their size against you. A moment where you were vulnerable and someone was weaponizing that vulnerability? A moment where you needed someone to say stop, to stand in front of you, to make it clear that you were worth protecting? Those moments teach you something about yourself. They teach you what it feels like to be alone in the face of someone else's cruelty. They teach you what injustice tastes like. And then there's probably another moment, or maybe many moments, where you stepped in for someone else, where you used whatever power or position or privilege you had accumulated to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves, where you made yourself slightly uncomfortable, slightly inconvenienced, slightly at risk, because you saw someone being hurt and you decided that couldn't continue, where you chose to be the person who shows up instead of the person who looks away, where you chose solidarity over comfort. That's the moment that defines character. That's the moment that actually makes a life matter. That's the moment that echoes forward into the future in ways you'll never fully understand, touching people you'll never meet, changing trajectories you'll never know about. Las Vegas is built on secrets. It's a city that understands the power of secrets. The casinos keep secrets about losses. The hotels keep secrets about what happens in rooms. The shows keep secrets about the people behind the performances. The city is full of hidden things, hidden selves, hidden truths, buried under layers of glamour and spectacle. But this was its most beautiful secret. Not a secret that was shameful or exploitative, a secret that was pure. A secret that was about someone choosing to be extraordinary in a moment where ordinary would have been acceptable, expected even. A secret that proves that kindness isn't weakness, that dignity can't be bought, and that real power is knowing when to use it to protect the powerless.